He had spent 40 years being told he was wrong. Dennis Reeves could recite, from memory, the precise moment a committee in London had lowered its collective eyebrows and handed him the professional equivalent of exile. He could recite the exact language used in the editorial: speculative, unorthodox, methodologically unsound. He could feel, like a bruise that never quite healed, the edge of each dismissal. For 4 decades he had folded those rejections into the same worn leather briefcase that sat now under his armchair in a small house in Tempe, Arizona. Pages of field notes, carbon copies of letters never answered, high-resolution photographs of erosion patterns no one in his old department had wanted to examine. That night a cable documentary, slick, shallow, convenient, aired the same old line. Pyramids were tombs. They ran close-ups of sarcophagi and hieroglyphs, said phrases about pharaohs and afterlives in a tone meant to put an end to speculation. Dennis watched the program through a haze that was part rage and part grief. He rose, paced, and finally flung a brittle, yellowing photograph at the blank screen as if he could puncture the lie with the face of an argument. The photograph landed, the frame rattled. He laughed once, an ugly, small sound, and then, without thinking, he said the thing he had whispered for 20 years in conference hallways and empty lecture rooms. They don't understand what they are looking at. The house answered with its evening silence. Then the world leaned. A light came through the curtains like a second moon. It wasn't the white of street lamps or the cold LED of a neighbor's security system. It was liquid and deep, somewhere between cobalt and the blue of old tidal glass. It moved as if it were looking for a place to stand, a presence that did not announce itself through sound so much as by altering the weight of the air. Dennis, who had once spent nights in the desert measuring stellar alignments, held his breath. His body, old, stubborn, proud, tensed as if ready to run. But his mind, the thing that had survived academic ridicule, leaned forward. It entered the room like a question. He did not see a classical alien with limbs and mask. He saw geometry of light folding in on itself, a lattice of faintly luminous threads that somehow conveyed posture, attentive, patient, intent. And then a thought landed in his skull as if someone had pressed a finger to a piano string and let it sing. Dennis Reeves, you are right about much. Come. The voice was not heard with ears. It arrived as a structure of meaning. It carried no accent, but its cadence had weight. It placed nouns where context was usually hoped for, and verbs where apology often lived. He flinched away, then leaned in. For all his years cataloging stone and symbol, he had not cataloged the experience of being directly addressed by something that was not human. Skepticism, the old scholarly reflex, rose like a tide. But beneath it, in a place he had learned to trust through nights of studying inscriptions and the awkward loneliness of belief, sat a yearning the committees could not measure. Why me? He thought, wordless but clear. Because you have looked further than most, the voice answered. Because you remember enough to learn again. Because you lost more than you kept. It told him it could not take physical form in his space. Rules, it said telepathically, a kind of soft legalism, but it could bridge consciousness. It offered something that, in the language Dennis used in grant applications and peer reviews, would be called evidence of an entirely different category, direct experience. I will project your consciousness, it said. You will witness. I will translate what it is safe for a thinking organism to know. He laughed once. He had been laughed at so much, he thought laughter might be the closest thing left to a tool with which to split a hard fact. He imagined colleagues, stern men and women who could quote Herodotus and temperature curves, poking fun at the idea that a light might mind-scan him and take him on a tour. Yet the photograph still lay on the floor, and the documentary was still thumping the same shallow drum. He had been right before about details the modern line assumed were closed. There were patterns in masonry nobody had explained. There were acoustic markings carved into granite that matched nothing known to funerary practice. There were anomalies that stacked into an argument. "Show me proof," he thought. The voice accepted the demand as if it had been a polite request. There was no trumpet, no rapid transport. There was a sensation like descent, a long internal elevator of sound that made bones hum and teeth feel light. The living room blurred. The photograph of a weathered assault face melted into a field of stars. The alien did not speak in sentences the way people did. It offered images and a kind of slow scan meaning that did for concepts what a microscope does for cells. He understood, without being taught, how to interpret the patterns. A rhythm felt like texture. The vibration of a particular tone was a field you could walk through, and the field altered metal and flesh with a clarity he had only ever seen in computer models he once used to simulate acoustic resonance. He saw hands, human hands, placing a crystal, not chiseling, but arranging. He saw enormous blocks of limestone wedge themselves free of quarries, as if the stone itself decided to float. He heard, in a way that made his jaw tense, a tone that seemed tuned to bones and water. It was not noise, it was a key. This is a vision, the only word he could find later when he tried to write an email about it to himself. He would later, on paper, preface everything with caution, according to the experience. He saw. The alien explained telepathically. For now, he was inside it. Temple crews moved like a choreographic of intent. The non-human overseers were tall shadows that glinted at the edges like obsidian with veins of light. They did not wrench stone with muscle, but with a geometry of force that the sailor in Dennis remembered from a physics seminar, a field that could be altered by precise modulation of frequency. Crystalline columns, hung like chandeliers over granite platforms, lit up when struck by 90 cycles of a single tone that vibrated the air at a pitch the alien translated for Dennis as the equivalent of 432 hertz in the terms his ear knew. It was an imperfect translation. Sound across minds necessarily lost some human temporal detail, but the gesture was clear. Frequency here was not ornament, it was architecture. Pulleys were present, but they were not the main actors. Small crews, human and not, tended arrays of suspended crystals. When the crystals were aligned and the tone was struck, the limestone blocks lifted with the slow dignity of whales surfacing, their shadows off the desert tilting like slow hands. They moved on invisible rails of vibration. Men walked beside them with ropes that were less for pulling and more for guiding the field around zones of safety. Where rope touched stone, stone cooled. Where it did not, it hummed. The alien's translation was clinical at times, as if translating for a mind eager for data. They used resonance to reduce effective mass, it said. They altered the local field so matter rearranged with less stress. Crystals acted as nodes. Geometry tuned them. Dennis noticed things no camera in the modern day could catch. The way dust fell in slow spirals inside the field when stones rose. The way a line of young trainees placed their palms on an oblong crystal and their fingers lit faint blue, as if sympathy currents passed through their bodies. These were not magical pyrotechnics. They were a technology of relationships. Sound, stone, and living tissue interacting in elegant sequence. The pyramids were not simply stacked masonry. They were the visible seams of a system. He watched workers setting cladding, gleaming limestone, over a core built of heavier, coarser stone. The outer skin was polished until it reflected like a river. The alien's projection emphasized the capstone, a small, intense object, often described in later texts as gilded or golden, that sat at the apex like a bird on a post. It was not decorative. Dennis felt viscerally that the capstone completed an electrical loop. When set, it bridged the interior harmonic of the structure to the sky. At one moment, a young initiate, hair cropped, face smeared with resin and sand, was led into a scaffolding ring that arced around a sarcophagus. The stone sarcophagus was plain, dense, and smooth, but when the initiate lay inside, there was a hum, not loud, but utterly encompassing. Lights ran along the sarcophagus seams like veins. Dennis could not see the pattern with the naked human eye. His mind's translator rendered it as 432. The alien offered the concept that the scale and mode of resonance, the octave they used, moved not only stone but biological processes. It modulates tissue, the projection said briefly. It aligns. Alignment. The word was a thin reed standing up through the roaring vision. He had taught students about alignment curves in ancient structures as if they were metaphors. Here, the word took on flesh. For a person who had written papers about erosion, weather, and misattributed mortuary practices, this scene destabilized categories. The pharaoh was not merely a hereditary political figure in this vision. The pharaoh Dennis saw was a figure who had undergone a process, an initiation. He watched the initiate's pupils widen, a sheen of moisture appear at the inner tear ducts, a slow inhalation that sounded like an intake of the world in a different size. The alien translated a fragment of the experience into something categorical. Pharaohs were activated teachers, it offered. They had bodies but were instruments made coherent by vibration in a community practiced at holding field. Dennis breathed. It was a rational translation of a mystical moment. The ancient craft had a purpose beyond pomp. It seemed to him, looking through the lens the alien provided, that these constructions were schools. Stone was language. Geography was curriculum. The Nile and the sequence of temples were a schooling system for consciousness. He saw the pyramids, 3, 5, 10, constructed in a sequence that matched nothing he had read as funerary process. The arrangement of axes, the alignments with celestial points, the sizes and ratios, there was a modular pattern that suggested active networks. When the alien showed him the capstone being set, the camera of his mind tightened. The capstone dropped into place with a sound like a bell heard through a blanket. Light flared up the stone as if a pulse had traveled along a spine and out the crown. For a heartbeat, the desert was full of noise. Human exclamations, the crackle of resonance, the scent of heated resin, and then a calm that was not emptiness but readiness. This is what they designed to do, the alien said, to bring human systems into coherence with stellar harmonics. Dennis wanted to ask, why Orion? Why those stars? The alien answered before he thought the question fully. It showed a map in his mind, a lattice of stars, Orion marked like a reference point, and how the capstones, when aligned, acted like tuning forks aimed at a radio signal, whose wavelength was not electromagnetic in a narrow sense, but relational, the relational geometry between planetary, stellar, and biological cycles. The translation was poetic and functional. He later wrote the phrase in his notebook that night, geometry as antenna. In the vision, the Anunnaki had not simply imposed technology, they had taught. They moved among humans like master carpenters in a shop, placing a hand on a shoulder, correcting an angle, whispering instructions. Dennis saw technology as pedagogy. There were scenes of instruction, a group of students learning to listen to a sound until they could predict the pattern of interference. A woman taught to place her tongue against a particular palate ridge to amplify a tone internally. An elder showing a child how to move their eyes in a pattern that matched a glyph carved on the wall, the motion turning the glyph into an experience rather than a mark. He also saw restraint. There were moments when the overseers took a step back, watching a gathering that grew too excited, and the lights dimmed like an admonition. The alien, calm, matter-of-fact, Translated. Initiation requires ethical readiness. The field amplifies what is present. It can heal or harm depending on intent and balance. That line sat in Dennis like a murmur of agreement he could not have predicted to enjoy. He had always thought of ancient rulers as either benevolent priest-kings or tyrannical overlords. This vision complicated both images. Power here demanded maturity. As the building continued, the alien guided his attention to details a camera would miss. A seam in the granite door of one chamber, where an inlay of non-local metal glowed faintly. A string of small bead-like objects embedded in a sill that, when touched, shifted the harmonic of the room. A soft-lined map carved under an eave that showed not marches and borders, but pathways of frequency, lines like rivers that indicated where sound could be held and where it would dissipate. Dennis physically felt, the way frequency bent around shapes. He watched, helpless and intoxicated, as workers moved a block that should have taken hundreds of men to lift, and it rose instead with a grace that made the supervisors weep. For the first time in decades, the old exhilaration he felt as a young field archaeologist, when a trench revealed a shard that changed a chronology, returned with a force that was almost cruel. He had come into this life to know the shape of the past. The past, now, was offering its throat to be cut with a knowledge he had not imagined. When the pyramid sat finished for a moment, there was a hush in the vision. The capstones glowed, each as if turned on by a hidden switch. From the outer skin of each pyramid, thin lines of light raced down edges into the desert. The alien's voice, the only steady thing in a sea of images, translated the pattern. Once active, they became nodes in a network. A local choir of resonators could, in communion, shift the coherence of organisms within the field. Dennis had questions forming in him like wasps. Would the field have predictable effects? Could it cure disease? The alien's reply was patient. He saw the histories and the harms. It is not a cure-all, the projection said. It is a precision instrument. Used with wisdom, it harmonizes. Used without, it escalates pre-existing tendencies. That was all the science he would receive for now. The vision was not a manual. It was an immersion designed to reawaken pattern recognition. He was inside an experience that carried both awe and admonition. He was an observer, but not a detached one. His chest felt full with other people's fear and joy. The construction sequence moved into ceremony. The island of scaffolding around the central pyramid shifted into an amphitheater. Men and women, some with no visible ornament, some with crystalline pendants that chimed when they moved, gathered in a ring. A young person, perhaps 20, perhaps older, ages blurred in the projection, stood in the center. The elder placed something small and glossy against the person's forehead. Dennis saw the tip of a finger, the sheen of a paste, the glint of sunlight. It was only when the elder pressed the small object that a soft pulse began to move, not outward, but inward. Light, not metaphorical light, but something that read in his sensory translation as visible, moved beneath the skin. Tiny sparks traced the child's jawline, a network of lumens dancing along nerves. The alien offered a phrase for what he was witnessing: DNA unknotting in sequence with pineal activation. It explained, cautiously and with an almost academic patience, that certain vibrational fields loosened mineral deposits calcified within glandular structures and could allow an opening of perception. Dennis felt that statement like a bell, provocative, dangerous to some, illuminating to others. He knew the traps of language. To frame this as a guaranteed chemical process would be fraudulent. He also knew the power of personal testimony. Having participated in the projection, he had no reason to lie and a plethora of reasons to disbelieve. Yet the image burned, a brightening behind the young person's eyes, a soft crack as if some intracellular lattice reconfigured into a different shape. The projection shifted. He saw the Sphinx for the first time in the vision, its expression younger than he had ever imagined from weathered stone. Its lines seemed to hold a memory of smoothness. The air around the creature shimmered. Beneath its paws, in a carved recess, there was a pattern of folds like concentric circles. The alien's translation narrowed: guardian, integrator, depository. Dennis, who had spent a professional lifetime measuring, chiseling patterns and erosion, could not have predicted how seeing the Sphinx like this would upend him. The abstraction of the sentinel, guarding thresholds, he had read it as symbol, as political instrument, but now it appeared to him as a map's keystone. The alien did not explain everything. It showed and trusted his mind to extrapolate. He was not allowed, the projection assured, to touch history as if he had a right to manipulate it. He was there to witness, to carry back an encoded impression. The alien-shaped experience into pedagogy. See the system, remember the ethics, understand the collapse, and then, only then, consider the present. When consciousness drifted from the vision, it did not snap like a rubber band. It unfurled slowly, like a cloud being coaxed into a familiar sky. He returned first to the sound. His living room hummed faintly with that 432 translation, a residual scratch on the membrane between worlds. In the moments before sight came back fully, he clung to the memory of a stone's warmth under his palm, and the particular quality of reverence that had nothing to do with awe and everything to do with duty. Dennis sat for a long time. His palms were pressed flat to his knees. His heart beat as if he had run, though he had not moved. He catalogued what he had seen like a scientist trying to salvage an experiment before the fuse blew. Capstones as antennas, crystals as nodes, resonance as a means of manipulating effective mass, initiation as education, initiatory effects described as alignment, pineal and DNA imagery as metaphors and as experiential facts within the projection. He reached for an old notebook, spine cracked, pages loose, and made a single line. Vision, construction plus resonance plus pedagogy. Atlantis? Possibly referenced under Sphinx. Seal? Frequency-based gate. He underlined frequency seal twice. A cold, human skepticism rose at the edges of his tendrils of wonder. He had, in his life, been careful with words. He had measured. He had argued. He had lost positions over that care. Now, in his small Arizona kitchen, he found himself deciding between silence and utterance. The voice, if voice is the right map for a telepathic structure, did not push. It simply awaited. The house hummed with a memory of sound he could not reproduce, a frequency that somehow reoriented his internal narratives. "Will you show me more?" he thought, naive in its hope. The answer occupied less time than a blink. It came as an image. 3 temporal layers would be offered: the ancient function, the golden age, and decline, the present-day echoes. Each would be a journey he could take on different nights. "You may not remember everything at once," the translation said. "Memory returns in pieces. That is how systems heal." He laughed then, not out loud, but the laugh was the split of an old seam. He was a man who had been offered a map, in essence, after decades of derision. He tried to be careful. He tried to imagine the embarrassment of returning and being told he'd hallucinated. But the images were here in his hands in a way that defied normal categories. He was a scientist by temperament, but he had long ago learned that some of the world resists science's need for neat boxes. Before he could fold the evening into bed and the night into forgetfulness, he did one small, honest thing. He reached for his phone and recorded a trembling note to self, a primitive artifact of the modern age. Do not frame as empirical. Visionary claim, document, seek corroboration. He hit save. The recorder echoed back his voice like a small proof. And then he turned to the camera in the corner of the living room, a cheap model he'd bought to practice lectures for a classroom that no longer existed, and he made a choice. He placed his elbows on his knees, leaned forward, and looked straight into the lens as if it were the same committee that had once judged him. "If this speaks to you," he said, into a medium that might one day be his audience, "if something in you recognizes these images, subscribe and check the pinned comment for a guidebook I've put together, Reconnecting with Your Divine Essence, for those who want a careful, measured way to explore what resonates. This isn't an invitation to abandon caution. It is an invitation to remember." It was small. It was pragmatic. It followed the rules the alien had set in showing him the first arc. Present as testimony, not as dogma. Offer a resource to those who felt moved. He felt an odd thrill at the idea that a pinned comment could serve as a modest bridge between his solitude and some other human presence. He saved the file, and the feeling of being slightly less alone settled down around him. He slept, if sleep it could be called, in a room filled with after-images. Dreams were not the right word. It was more a continuation in the same key. He saw the blue lattice again, but this time it braided into other images. Columns of light rising from river water, small brass instruments moving like fish, a human mouth forming an unnameable sound that made a crystal ring like a bell. He woke before dawn with the feeling that he had been allowed into something that required a return. The next night, as promised by the projection, the alien offered the second vision. It was not the same as the first. Where the first had been work and pedagogy, the second was ritual and community. Dennis found himself among crowds in a different time. People with jewelry that reflected unfamiliar metals, children running along processional paths, priests in garments that were more functional than ornate, each section serving as a resonant chamber maker. The Anunnaki, whose presence had been more like a lineage of teachers in the first sequence, appeared now as shadowed masters who orchestrated cadence in human communities. Dennis felt the tidal pull of a society in which initiation was not for spectacle, but an everyday practice. The Nile flowed, and the river itself seemed tuned. Its currents carried mineral and microstructures that shimmered under light the alien translated as nanoscale crystals. The water was not magically pure. It was engineered by habit and management. Channels that slowed flow to allow particulates to orient. Basins that encouraged certain sedimentation. Reed beds that acted like filters. The Anunnaki, whose presence had been more like a lineage of teachers in the first sequence, appeared now as shadowed masters who orchestrated cadence in human communities. Dennis felt the tidal pull of a society in which initiation was not for spectacle, but an everyday practice. The Nile flowed, and the river itself seemed tuned. Its currents carried mineral and microstructures that shimmered under light the alien translated as nanoscale crystals. The water was not magically pure. It was engineered by habit and management. Channels that slowed flow to allow particulates to orient. Basins that encouraged certain sedimentation. Reed beds that acted like filters. When people bathed in certain temples, their skin did not simply become clean. They moved through a gradient designed to shift their internal resonance. Water as living technology, the projection rendered. It made sense in the way that suddenly seeing the function of a tool does. Ordinary, inevitable, and quietly revolutionary. He watched women come to a temple for sequences of immersion. They were not healed as a medical chart would describe. Rather, they reported, in the language of the vision, easing, clarity, a softening of edges. The alien was careful to place distance between experience and promise. There were patterns of relief, not guaranteed, but recurrent in context of full initiation. He followed processions to temples dedicated to forms the later scriptural traditions would name Isis and Horus and Hathor and Osiris. The projection did not insist on one-to-one identification. Instead, it suggested lineage. These names were labels that later cultures would layer on older functions. In the first temple, devoted in the vision to a form Dennis would later read as Isis, the focus was on healing through water and touch. A practitioner guided a pilgrim's breath with a sequence of chants that moved like a tide through her chest. A layer of clay, infused with crushed crystal, was pressed to temples to enhance sensitivity. Dennis felt his own lungs mimic the pattern until they began to taste salt. In another temple, a narrow hall lined with reflective stone amplified small ocular movements into the perception of motion that did not belong to the eye alone. Third eye clarity, the alien's translation supplied. Dennis saw initiates trained to read faint geomantic patterns etched into walls, and to see those patterns as fields rather than marks. In the Temple of Hathor, the emphasis was on opening the body to joy, drumming, dance, and harmonic laughter that served as a form of integration rather than mere entertainment. In Osiris's halls, there were enactments of death and rebirth that involved symbolic letting go, not actual mortality, but relinquishment of ego attachments in a ritualized context. Taken together, the temples formed a curriculum, tending the body, awakening perception, celebrating the self into cohesion, and finally surrendering what needed to loosen. The Nile braided these stations into a living root. It was not, the alien emphasized, a magic trick. It was an architecture for internal reshaping. For someone like Dennis, who had held ceremonial texts at arm's length because of his training, the visceral reality of the sequence challenged his categories. What unsettled him most was not the technology or the ceremony, but the humility embedded in the practice. The Anunnaki were careful not to grant power without maturity. In a scene he later replayed until the edges blurred, a communal council halted an initiation when a candidate's heart was judged too bound by personal grievance. The music dulled, the crystals dimmed. The candidate returned home, instructed to prepare for another season. It was a small, bureaucratic act that tasted like mercy. There were other moments that prickled his skin with recognition. He watched, in a fragment that made him feel like a voyeur caught in a corridor of time, as records were prepared. Metal tablets, crystalline data slates, and a particular class of object that was neither wholly metal nor wholly stone. He remembered them later because they fit a pattern he had long suspected. The past had tried to safeguard knowledge. The alien suggested that not all storage forms survive time in the same way. Some materials, because of their crystalline matrix, retained frequency patterns better, as if they were less prone to the corrosion of narrative. The projection softened when it turned toward decline. Dennis felt the tone shift like weather. The first images were of crowds, of abundance. Then came scenes of theft, teams of opportunists removing outer cladding, the polished limestone skinned off in slabs and carted away. He saw the capstones, once central, lie discarded or melted down to gleam for rulers indifferent to function. There were bands of outsiders, some pressed by hardship, some enticed by value, and the system that had required ritual and consensus found itself treated as a resource. Those images were not offered as accusation, but as consequence. The alien translated with a measured voice. Systems degrade when their social protocols unravel. Knowledge stored in culture is fragile if the practice stops. The voice did not use modern political vocabulary. It described patterns. Knowledge stored in stone loses efficacy without caretakers. Capstones removed break the loop. The field becomes noisy. He watched, with a detachment he would later name as grief, how frequencies that once cohered people instead interacted chaotically. Where once initiations had been regulated, now small groups tried to replicate effects with partial knowledge. The consequence was predictable, a mix of partial awakenings, psycho-spiritual crises, and technologies abused. It was in those blurred sequences, sketches of panic, resonance misapplied, that the alien, with a rare directness, showed him the memory that would, later in modern life, be called Atlantis. Dennis saw a distant city across a sheet of water, an archipelago of towers and platforms that glittered with crystalline arrays. He was not shown the everyday life of the place for long. The projection fast-forwarded into argument, debates about wielding power, experiments with resonant devices that attempted to harness climate and tides, and then, the moment of escalation, multiple nodes misaligned, frequencies interfering, and energy redirected in ways nobody intended. The result was catastrophic. The sea took geometry and turned it into ruin. The vision was merciless in its compression. It did not dwell on quiet suffering, but instead laid bare a pattern. Technological skill, absent ethical containment, will, amplify existing tendencies toward harm. The alien offered no simplistic moralizing. It simply suggested that certain technologies had reach, and that human systems needed to be mature to steward them. The image of cities sinking under a sky that seemed to wail with sound stayed in Dennis like a stain. When the projection returned to the Nile's banks in a gentler mode, it showed an act of preservation. Some of the artifacts from the drowned cities, tablets, slivers of vacuum-sealed memory, had been taken and concealed. The Sphinx, in that moment of translation, became not only a guardian for local thresholds, but a repository. Under its paws, the projection suggested, sat an archive, objects sealed with frequency locks that would only open to collective patterns of readiness. Dennis woke from that sequence with the taste of salt in his mouth, though he had not been near the sea. In the gray light of morning, his mind catalogued the arc: construction, initiation, golden age, misuse, and the deliberate act of concealment. The alien's method was thorough. It offered both explanation and warning, but in the grammar of possibility, not proclamation. He sat at his kitchen table and drank tea that had cooled to near room temperature. The hearth of the house was quiet. Outside, the street woke to the Arizona sun. Yet, Dennis felt the pull of responsibilities he had not expected to shoulder. He had seen enough to know that certain questions, if asked badly, could become instruments for harm. He had also been given enough to know that the public, the small network of seekers he had once thought of as hypothetical, might find something essential in the images. In the days that followed, he lived dividedly. He taught himself to move like a man with a secret of state. Not secret for the sake of hoarding, but secret out of prudence. He wrote pages that read like slow revelations, notes on crystal matrices, sketches of capstone geometry, a list of temples and their corresponding functions as the projection had shown. Isis, healing through water and touch. Horus, clarity and sight. Hathor, embodied joy. Osiris, death and reintegration. He numbered them as if a student taking an exam. He checked piles of weathered photographs and noticed, suddenly, small details he'd never registered. A line at the base of a lintel that corresponded to a pattern in a metalwork tablet he'd once photographed in a Cairo market. Corroboration, he thought. This is how a scientist steadies hands. He put the pieces together carefully. The alien had given him images and hints. He needed, in a way that felt like an oath, to ensure he did not convert those images into dogma when he set them down for others. He promised himself he would use language like "I saw" and "the projection suggested," and avoid definitive claims where he lacked evidence. He also vowed, fiercely, that he would not let those with power after the collapse continue to hide what had been hidden. Not because he wanted notoriety, but because he felt the moral shape of testimony pressing at his ribs. Not everyone would welcome his work. He expected ridicule. He expected dismissal. Yet the vision had given him something stranger, a sliver of confidence that the narrative he had defended for years about the active function of structures was not merely a novel theory, but part of a living memory that sought recognition. He wrote the phrase down, stones as instruction code. It sounded theatrical on paper, but in his chest it felt like the simplest way he could make his case. When he returned home from a short walk, the sky had shifted to mauve. He thought of the Sphinx again. He thought of the sealed chamber the alien had winked at. He had the sense, a faint tremor at first, Then a stronger thrum, that the path forward required that he go. Not as a thief, not as a vandal, but as a witness prepared to speak in the language the modern world would understand. Careful observation, corroboration, and, if necessary, patient advocacy. The alien had promised more. The third sequence, present-day echoes, the pilgrimage of modern seekers, the opening and partial activation of sensitive visitors awaited. But that night, sitting at his kitchen table with a map of Egypt and a notebook marked with arrows and a single fearful phrase, frequency seal, he let himself be human. He allowed himself to be dizzy from revelation and fright. He allowed himself to be the man who had been wronged and now, possibly, vindicated in the strangest way. Something in him had shifted. It was not a conversion, he would scoff at such a thing, but a reorganization of priorities. The work he had once tried to publish in journals that wanted tidy proofs now felt like a calling to something stranger, to carry testimony and to catalyze careful seekers. He imagined small groups in kitchens and basements, in living rooms like his, listening to his recorded notes and asking cautious questions. He imagined people traveling down the Nile, not as tourists, but as pilgrims seeking initiation, a careful cohort looking for techniques more than spectacle. They would come with questions, with old wounds, with the tiny stubborn hope that some precise ritual might rearrange the internal map enough to let them breathe. In Dennis's mind, the river became a curriculum embodied, a route not of postcards, but of practical sequences people could learn to hold in their bodies. He pictured slow mornings of breathwork by canals, evenings in temple courtyards, learning how to listen until a stone answered back. He began, privately at first, to gather names. Emails came in as if by magnet. A woman in Lisbon who said she remembered a past life as a scribe and sent a photograph of a scar that matched a glyph on his notebooks. A retired engineer in Ohio who'd spent his life building antennas and could not shake the memory of a humming metal lattice. A young man from Cairo who wrote in hesitant English that his grandmother had hummed the same low tone in childbirth and that the sound made him feel like the world itself had softened. There were skeptics too, sharp, necessary people who asked for dates, for documentation, for anything replicable. He welcomed them. He needed them to keep his own edges cautious. Word online moved like a current. He posted measured accounts, phrases like visionary claim and according to the projection on every page. He offered photographs with annotations, maps with arrows, and hypotheses laid out as such. Hypothesis, not certitude. He documented the details the projection had emphasized that could be examined. Seams in stone, inlay traces, peculiar alignments of cisterns. Slowly, carefully, a community gathered around what he called his Tempe notebook. Small synchronicities began to happen that his old self, conditioned to expect disappointments, flagged as improbable. A distant cousin of a former student showed up with a modest donation large enough to buy a plane ticket. A previously indifferent friend offered to help with travel logistics. The money arrived in amounts that matched nothing Dennis thought likely. It arrived, narratively, as a rope of small helps. Someone lending frequent flyer miles, another friend arranging a speaking introduction to a curator in Cairo who had once published a cautious paper on acoustic anomalies in a New Kingdom temple. Dennis kept a running tally, and he called none of it proof. He had learned too well the arrogance of such words, but he named it opening. When he stepped into Cairo for the first time on actual physical feet, the city hit him like an enormous living palimpsest. Heat pressed against skin. The air was a dense, layered thing where diesel and incense and river breath mingled. He felt clumsy with modernity, his phrase books and polite manners, yet he moved toward the Nile with something like homecoming in his chest. He met the curator in a basement library between stacks of brittle journals and learned to speak the way archivists do, slow, careful, grateful for receipts and catalog numbers. The curator, an efficient woman with a soft smile, did not call him friend. She did, however, agree to help arrange a supervised visit to a conservation lab that managed access to certain scholarly sites under strict protocols. Access in his narrative was never illicit. Dennis had the planet of a man who respected the dignity of place. He learned to ask for permissions the way he had once applied for excavation rights, in paperwork and in person, and with an awareness of the legacy of exploitation. The curator cautioned him about sensational claims. She asked him to sign forms promising to place all findings in proper channels. He agreed. In his notebook he wrote, "Respect as praxis." The physical trip mirrored the dream sequences he'd seen. When he stood for the first time in the shadow of the Great Pyramid, it had a presence that no photograph had captured. The sun painted the angles like a rehearsal of light. The outer casing, where it remained, caught the warmth and reflected a gold that looked like a promise. People were small around it. He thought of the capstone, now missing in its original radiance, and imagined the hum that must have passed along its spine. He walked the pathways the alien had shown him in a projection, and felt, below ordinary sensory input, the leftover hum of stone that his years of attunement nudged awake. He did not attempt to force anything. He simply practiced listening. Within weeks, and this part of the story he later described with both wonder and the careful hedges of academic language, some visitors reported distinct experiences. A woman in her 40s who had traveled with the modest group described an unexpected opening in dream imagery, a clear set of oceanic memories that arrived as if edited film. A man who had been near breakdown for years found he could hold his breath and map a shape of memory without the same panic. Dennis recorded these accounts and always framed them as subjective. He refused to make clinical claims. He insisted that experiences varied, that expectation and background mattered, and that people with certain histories should consult professionals before attempting intense practices. But he could not deny pattern. There were enough similar motifs, waves of warmth behind the eyes, a sense of the world rearranged at the level of meaning, to suggest a real effect. In Egypt, an unexpected, consequential encounter altered the course the curator planned. At a small gathering of scholars and conservators, people skeptical enough to make Dennis's old committee nod with approval, an elder appeared, a woman known to some as a keeper of certain oral lineages in the Nile Valley. She had spent her life among reed beds, tending songlines and the small rituals of local remembrance. Her presence was not meant to legitimize Dennis. It did something stranger. She tested him with a look that could be read as hunger or as caution. Then she said, softly, in accented English, "You have seen stones that sing. You do not sing to take. You sing to hear what the stones already say." It was the sentence that, in the projection, the alien had hinted might be needed, a human steward willing to broker local care with scholarly curiosity. The elder asked for time. She requested an audience in which certain songs could be sung and certain patterns held in the presence of custodians. The conservators agreed to witness. The ministry issued a permit for a supervised ritual pattern test in a sealed chamber used rarely for conservation work, provided that no destructive techniques were used and that any contact would remain purely energetic and documented. Dennis's hands shook as the day came. He had not been promised the Sphinx chamber. The Sphinx still, officially, had no accessible gap. But here was a permitted, ethical opening, a test lab where, under watchful conservators, a ritual might be enacted that replicated at a small scale the conditions the projection had suggested. They would attempt to demonstrate whether the capstone-anchored sequences and certain harmonic inputs produced measurable, replicable energy signatures in a conservation environment. It was science-conscious, not sensationalist. It was also, in its own way, terrifying. The room they used was a small, temperature-controlled vault with walls of stone and supporting instrumentation. Crystalline nodes, cleared for study, were placed on stands the conservators approved. Tuned instruments, not exotic or dangerous, simply precise frequency generators and field meters, were installed under supervision. The elder and a small cadre of local singers, people who had practiced certain reed singing forms for decades, prepared. Dennis stayed at the edge, heart a drum. The alien, as he would later tell listeners, did what it had done before. It tuned his internal attention.
He allowed his breath to echo their rhythms. They began. A low, sustained tone pooled in the space. Nothing dramatic, no light show, just a measured, patterned vibration at the approximate human translation of 432 Hz. The local singers layered microtonal harmonics in a way that felt ineffably old and immediately practical. A vowel held, then released, a throat pattern that hummed the air like a string. A conservator watched readouts and whispered to a colleague about spectral shifts in harmless electromagnetic noise. Dennis kept his eyes closed and let the rhythm find his chest. Something loosened, a thin film of anxious identification that had clung to him for decades. He felt the world tilt, not outward, but inward. He could not, would not claim miracle. He could claim that something happened that he could not translate into the categories of his previous training. In the minutes that followed, the instruments recorded micro-changes that the conservators wrote down as anomalies deserving of further study. The ambient air warmed by fractions of a degree. Tiny crystals on a test surface registered a change in resonance. The elder later told him, with a seriousness that made the conservators listen like children, that the chamber had answered in a manner consistent with the patterns she'd been taught to hold. The conservators asked rigorous questions. They planned repeat tests. They were, in other words, exactly what Dennis wanted: skeptical witnesses who now sat on the same shore as a witness who'd come by a different water.
That night, in his small hotel room, Dennis lay awake with the memory of the sarcophagus from his first projection, before the living room and before the lab. The next step, the alien had offered, would not be merely to observe or to measure. It would be to undergo, within a supervised, ethically sanctioned context, the initiation the projection had shown. A slow, carefully documented vibrational journey in a stone sarcophagus that some conservators allowed to be used in controlled conditions for responsible research. He was 40 years older than his fellow initiates had been in the vision. He was also, by temperament, a man who had argued for precision. He applied to be a volunteer. People tend to ask how much of this was courage and how much was habit. For Dennis, it was an accumulation of both. An old habit of leaning into the past with instruments, and a new courage born of a sense that if he did not put himself in the path of what he had seen, the testimony would remain merely personal. The conservators required physicians to be present. They insisted on oversight. They drew up consent forms thicker than university grant proposals. Dennis read each one and, with hands that remembered excavation brushes, signed carefully. The sarcophagus itself seemed ordinary at first glance: dense granite, a well-worn interior polish. To a trained eye, it held the scars of age and use. To Dennis, who had seen the projection, it held a memory tricked into 3 dimensions. The day of the ritual, a modest number of witnesses gathered: conservators, the elder, a pair of skeptical scholars, and a couple of the pilgrims who had joined him in Egypt. They would observe. They would verify. They would ensure the process remained within the bounds of safety. He lay down. The stone was cool, heavy, like a weight of a life contained. The elder placed a small crystal on his brow, not an exotic, forbidden object, but a clear, ethically sourced quartz set to a vibration pattern the elder's community had long used for centering. The singers arranged themselves outside the slab and began the same microtonal sequence as earlier. Dennis breathed into the pattern. He kept his training: slow inhale, lengthening exhale, a counting of the internal map until the fear, if fear appeared, was simply a waveform to be noted. The sensation that followed was not cinematic in the way some might imagine. There was no blinding tunnel. There was a progressive unhooking, a loosening of the name tags he'd worn for so long. Memory rose not as a linear reel, but as flashes of feeling. A child's small hand holding a reed instrument, the cold sand under feet, the precise motion of setting a capstone into place, the taste of resin. His sense of time dilated, seconds widened into the feeling of a year. For a moment, he experienced the uncanny decentering the alien had implied, identity as a chorus rather than a solo. He felt the pineal area in his head, an old focal point he had once dismissed as metaphor, tilt into a kind of audible attention. Tiny, subtle gusts of light seemed to pass through the edges of his vision. He later described this moment with the same cautious language he had used in his notes. "I experienced a sequence consistent with the project's pattern of unnodding and opening," he wrote. Subjective, non-verifiable in a lab, correlated with micro-reads in the environment. He refused to call it proof that the projection was correct in every detail. He accepted it as congruent with what the vision had shown. When the ritual ended and the stone lid was raised, he sat up in the small circle of witnesses. The room smelled faintly of resin and cool air. The conservators checked vitals and instruments. The skeptical scholars frowned, usefully so, and asked their questions. The pilgrims wept, quietly and without fuss. The elder patted his hand and said a word in her dialect that translated roughly as "returned." The alien, Dennis felt later as he tried to write it down, said telepathically, "We do not give gifts without readiness." He had felt readiness, and the evidence that something had shifted was not a miraculous healing, but a rearrangement of interior space. That, he believed, was plenty. The narrative returned, inevitably, to the Sphinx. While conservators could sanction a lab test and an ethical sarcophagus ritual, the chamber under the Sphinx remained, by all modern accounts, sealed. Dennis did not, in public or private, claim to access it by force. He did, however, spend long hours in conversation with the elder and with sympathetic scholars. And in those conversations, he learned a nuanced thing. The seal beneath the Sphinx was not purely physical. In the projection, it had been described as frequency-sealed, an arrangement where a set of harmonic gestures and communal readiness formed the key. In real-world terms, this translated into a cultural requirement. Keepers of certain lineages held protocols, songs, and practices intended to match the archive's gatekeeping mechanism. Those songs had, over centuries, become scattered. The archive had been intentionally hidden behind practices as much as stone. It was in the process of respectfully reassembling those practices, with the involvement and consent of local keepers, that the Sphinx's mechanism would become approachable. The elder called it retuning. Some conservators called it cultural reclamation. Dennis, who had spent his life arguing for evidence, called it necessary humility. After months of patient, careful work, meetings, demonstrations, protocol drafting, and the slow trust-building that often frustrates those who expect faster narratives, the elder and a small council of custodians approved an intentional, community-led ceremony at the edge of the Sphinx's precinct. It would not be an excavation. It would not be an opening fueled by curiosity alone. It would be an act of listening, held by local ritual and witnessed by trained conservators. The nation's antiquities ministry observed, and archaeologists prepared non-invasive scanning equipment. Dennis was asked to be present as a witness and as someone who had, in his own words, become a translator between the visions and the records. The day was raw and heavy. The precinct smelled of hot limestone. A crowd gathered at respectful distances. The elder sang first, a low, circular chant that made the hair along the nape of Dennis's neck stand like the bristles of a brush. Pilgrims and locals joined in, adding microtones that fit into the old lattice the alien had shown him in imagery. The conservators watched screens that displayed harmless spectral data. The stone under the Sphinx's paws registered negligible changes at first. Then, somewhere between the fourth and seventh harmonics, a minute shift aggregated in the instruments, a patterning of micro-vibrations that corresponded to a lock. People who observed later wrote of the moment with different words. A seal reverberated. An energetic alignment occurred. Non-invasive sensors recorded a pattern phase shift. Dennis described it in his notebook as the sound of a mechanism finding home. The Sphinx did not shout its secrets. It offered a measured opening, a cavity within which lay small, non-corroded objects, tablets of a metal he did not recognize, and thin crystalline slivers arranged like leaves. They were not cinematic treasure.
They were archival, deliberate, careful pieces arranged in a pattern that suggested intentional storage rather than hurried plunder. The conservators cataloged each item, and the elder performed a ritual of blessing. One tablet, upon careful scanning and careful authorized translation by both living language scholars and unconventional comparative analysts, contained narratives the elder recognized in threads, stories of a sea-locked city and of devices of weather and tide used without sufficient moral containment. The language on the tablet was not modern, and the images were schematic: rings, arches, lines intersecting like webbed fingers. The alien's projection had shown a similar map. The conservators did not call it proof of any single historical fact. They called it an important data point. Dennis called it confirmation of the narrative he had been entrusted to carry, records of a catastrophe and of deliberate concealment to prevent repetition. The translation, framed carefully and publicly as such, narrated a sequence. A civilization of engineers and artists leveraging resonance and large-scale field manipulation to alter their environment. Disputes about ethical restrictions. A cascading miscalculation when multiple nodes interfered. An escalation that produced catastrophic flooding and collapse. The tablet did not spell out modern analogies. It did not accuse any contemporary group.
Its warning, however, was clear in tone. Technology without ethical scaffolding can amplify harm. Dennis felt the gravity of it like a physical weight. He had expected denial, and he met that sometimes. He had expected some sympathetic scholarly curiosity, and he saw that too. The effect on his community, on the small cohort of pilgrims, and the online circle that had followed was a mixture of visceral awe and sobered responsibility. He emphasized again and again the necessary hedges. This was a visionary narrative corroborated by some archival fragments and by experiential sequencing. It was not a final history. It was a testimony with corroborations. Back in Arizona, the wheels of life resumed their old cadence, but with new grooves cut in them. Dennis wrote daily, published careful essays, and continued to host moderated sessions for those who sought training in inner attunement. He insisted upon a model of embodied ethics. Breathwork and listening practiced alongside obligations to community care and personal stability. He refused to monetize desperation. He offered a modest guidebook, Reconnecting with Your Divine Essence, not as a cure, but as a practical companion for those who wanted to pursue what he had learned with caution and integrity. The book explained techniques in plain language, described his experiences as vision, and suggested ways to approach pilgrimage and practice responsibly. As his small community grew, so did the awareness of partial activations among modern seekers. People reported déjà vu, sudden shifts in perception, and inexplicable synchronizations. Some experienced inner memory, visions of lives lived in different bodies. Others reported temporary disorientation. He compiled these reports and published them with commentary that urged support and medical consultation when needed. He asked compassionate readers to avoid romanticizing breakdown and warned against any claim of guaranteed miraculous cures. He had seen the harm that half-understood energy could cause, and he did not want his work to be another vector for it. In private, the alien continued to guide him in the projection spaces, 3 harmonized voyages where Dennis's consciousness, under supervision, reviewed the arc: the original function, the golden age and decline, and the present echoes. In those journeys, the alien expanded on ethical frameworks. Technology, it translated, is an amplifier. Culture is the regulatory system. It explained that the Ananakai, portrayed in later human mythologies as gods and in some texts as teachers, had taught a pedagogical model where technical power was always nested within social responsibility.
This is the part Dennis would later distill into what he called the 5 central truths, phrases he wrote on paper and framed in his talks as lessons drawn from his visions, his in-person experiences, and the archival fragments under the Sphinx.
He presented them cautiously and with qualifiers. These were distilled teachings from his testimony and the available records. He numbered them on his whiteboard and read them during a filmed talk in an empty lecture hall, the camera capturing his hands and the small tremor in his voice. The 5 central truths. 1. Structures are language. The stones of sacred architecture encode pedagogy, and misreading them loses more than data, it loses ethical formation. 2. Frequency is functional, not mystical. Vibrational practices act as precise instruments that can harmonize or amplify pre-existing tendencies depending on intent and preparation. 3. Initiation requires community and maturity. Power without ethical containment fractures communities. Readiness cannot be rushed. 4. Knowledge must be stewarded, not hoarded. Some groups have historically guarded fragments of knowledge out of fear or survival. Responsible transmission requires transparency, accountability, and cultural sensitivity. 5. Catastrophe is often human-made. Advanced techniques can fail catastrophically when deployed without embedded moral protocols. The fate of Atlantis in the records underscores stewardship as a civic responsibility. He framed each truth with hedges, in my experience, as the archive suggested, according to the projection. He made it his practice to use precise verbs. He refused to dress the truths as prophecy or as dogma. They were a moral architecture he hoped might steer modern use toward wiser ends. The climactic beat of his public work came when a documentary team, rigorous, with producers who insisted on balanced voices, asked to film a comprehensive piece. They wanted skepticism and wonder, the archival scans and the human testimony, the elders' songs and the conservator's measurements. The film, when released, would not topple governments. It would, however, show a global audience a careful, disciplined blending of ecstatic experience and scholarly moderation. It put Dennis in the company of people he had once envied at conferences, serious scholars, cautious curators, and the elder who, in a brief on-camera moment, looked directly into the lens and said, "We do not fear knowledge, we fear its misuse." The Sphinx chamber remained the narrative's fulcrum. What had been sealed beneath its paws was not a simple key to power, but rather an admonition. The memory of a civilization that had used advanced methods without sufficient ethical scaffolding and had paid a price. The records, in fragment and in story, suggested that Atlantis sank because those who had access to great amplifying techniques lacked a culture robust enough to regulate their deployment. That was the torrid kernel. Human weakness amplified. Dennis's voice, in interviews, grew sober. He did not brand modern institutions as conspiratorial villains. He spoke instead of historical secrecy and of some groups who had guarded fragments for reasons that ranged from protection to power. He emphasized that secrecy had at times been a sacrament of survival, but also warned that hoarding knowledge without accountable transmission invited catastrophe. Not everyone was placated by caution. Some viewers sought immediate answers, quick activations, shortcuts. Dennis refused those demands. He wrote in his book and said on camera what he had felt while inside the sarcophagus. Experiences were real, but preparation and integration were essential. He urged people to seek community care and to avoid solitary extreme practices. A measured excitement replaced frantic evangelism. His community grew, but it was small and disciplined. In the months that followed, other conservations continued. The tablets under the Sphinx were translated further. Some fragments suggested that certain artifacts had been intentionally altered to become time-locked, designed not for immediate use, but to test future readiness. The elder explained gently that cultures sometimes deferred access as a moral act.
This nuance reframed the project's public reception. The Sphinx had not hidden treasure to deprive, but had, perhaps, attempted to protect the world from a repetition. Dennis's life found a rhythm between witness and teacher. He traveled intermittently, return trips to Egypt, speaking engagements at universities, where sometimes he faced the old skeptical chairs, the odd glances from former colleagues who still could not reconcile their models with his testimony. He taught in living rooms, at small retreats, and online, with a strict code. Ethical training first, experiential practices second, and community integration as primary. He insisted on medical screenings and psychological checks for anyone seeking intense initiation work, and he maintained partnerships with trained therapists. The alien, which had first entered his living room as a lattice of blue and then offered a pedagogy across visions, did not promise a smooth future. In one projection, where Dennis's consciousness stood at the edge of a metaphorical ocean, the alien showed multiple possible timelines branching like light through a prism, some where knowledge was degraded into spectacle, others where it was woven into public institutions that learned restraint. The alien's translation was a quiet admonition. Potential destabilization exists. The truth you carry will unsettle some. But destabilization without ethical scaffolding is harm. Destabilization with care can be transformation. This very idea that certain revelations might shake established frameworks was why the title his listeners later used in clips circulated so widely. An alien showed me what really sank Atlantis. The truth will shake humanity. It was a provocative sentence, and Dennis understood its rhetorical power. He resisted hyperbole, but he also did not duck the gravity. The truth contained a destabilizing seed, a record that civilization could collapse under its technical genius without moral depth.
That learning, if widely recognized, could unsettle many. That, the alien said, was exactly the point. A culture that could survive technological power would need to be remade. The final turn of the narrative was not a triumphant crowning or a cataclysmic reveal. It was quieter. On the shore of the Nile at dusk, Dennis sat with the elder and a small circle of pilgrims. The air smelled of papyrus and cool river mud. Children ran along the bank and laughed, a sound that, in his projection, had once signaled cohesion. They spoke of ordinary things, the cost of a bus ticket, an old neighbor's illness, the next month's market. Then the elder turned to him and said, in a voice that could have been translation for the alien itself, "You must be a bridge, not a gate." He understood. His work was not to be a prophet who proclaimed doom, nor a zealot who promised miraculous cures. It was to carry testimony in a way that invited responsibility. He would continue to teach, to write, and to host careful pilgrimages. He would not claim exclusivity. He would curate access with ethical rigor. He would, as the alien had insisted, always frame experiences as testimony, powerful, noteworthy, but not the last word on history. In lectures from that point forward, he closed with the 5 central truths and with a practical exhortation. Learn the craft of listening before you build tools that amplify your will. He urged civic engagement, encouraging his audience to ask institutions for transparency, to support cultural caretakers, and to consider ethics as a civic technology no less important than engineering. He taught breathing patterns and gently guided meditations, and he continued his practice of cataloging visitor experiences with clinical care and an emphasis on integration. The story did not end with grand retribution or sweeping narrative closure. The tablets under the Sphinx did not reveal a single answer that would shake humanity and topple all assumptions in a day. Instead, they offered a slow, accumulating pressure, a record of caution and an invitation to learn. For Dennis, the personal arc closed in a way that felt right to his temperaments, vindicated in part, challenged in others, and finally committed to service.
He could no longer be the solitary scholar sharpening arguments alone. He was now a steward of testimony. On the last evening depicted in his recorded talks, he sat in front of the camera, older and steadier, and said what he had been saying in 1,000 forms. "This is my testimony. I will not claim absolute proof. I will not sell miracle cures. I will offer what I was given, an invitation to build your inner Egypt, to learn how to hold power ethically, and to listen to stone and river and neighbor before we deploy instruments that might amplify what we already are."
He laid out practical steps for those who felt the call. Study responsibly, seek community, consult professionals for mental and physical health, volunteer in cultural preservation, and support transparent scholarship. He offered, as many teachers do, a modest resource, a guidebook he had written, and a small network of vetted facilitators who minded both the heart and the archive. He closed the narrative not with a shout, but with a haunting image he had never been able to shake. A long desert night, capstones not yet replaced, the pyramids standing like sentinels, and the Sphinx, eyes to the rising stars, guarding tablets that hummed faintly in the language of the old calibration. The stones, he believed, were sleeping, but listening. They waited for ethical hands and hearts competent to read them. If the truth he carried could shake humanity, it would not be because of an alien's brag or a stolen artifact, but because it asked people, collectively and honestly, to be better custodians of what we create. The story he told was both a warning and an invitation. Cultivate depth before you amplify. Practice restraint before you unleash power. Tend community before you command fields. If any of what he had offered resonated, if you felt a slight ringing in the chest at the memory of a dream, if you longed for a path that married ethics with technique, he left a single practical step. Check the pinned comment for the guidebook, Reconnecting with Your Divine Essence, and for information about carefully curated retreats and community resources. There is no miracle promised there, only a modest map and an invitation to learn how to listen to stone, water, and the small, urgent voice of conscience.